Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly monthly workshop at Delia. Before we get started, I'm going to give everyone a few seconds to go ahead and log in. All right, so today we'll be talking about strategies for superior real estate investing. Our guest speaker is John Delia. I'm real excited. Before we do get started, there's a few disclaimers. So, NuView, we are not CPAs, we are not tax advisors. What we are is a self-directed IRA custodian. So, clients will use us as a conduit to be able to invest in what's called alternative assets. Similar to Delia, Charles Schwab, we are the same role except for they limit their investors to stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. And here at NuView, you are allowed to invest in things like real estate, tax things, mortgage notes, and the list goes on and on. Private companies, offshore real estate. We're going to dive a little deeper into that in a minute. What is a self-directed IRA? It gives you the option and the ability to choose your own investments. So you don't have a financial advisor picking and choosing stocks for you. You can invest in real brick and mortar assets. So that's what a true self-directed IRA is. So there's a few different types of plans that you can use to self-direct. Your first plan would be a traditional IRA, and that's the most common type of IRA most clients have. The reason it's the most common is because the majority of our clients have left their previous employer at some point. They're able to do a direct rollover from that account into a traditional IRA because most of the time it's pre-tax dollars. If you're over the age of 50, there's an additional $1,000 cash contribution, and then there's the Roth IRA. So a lot of times those pre-tax accounts can be converted into a Roth, or there's clients that have already started those Roths, made those contributions, and slowly build that up. So it gives the clients the opportunity to invest this money in this bucket of money, but it's going to be tax-free growing versus the traditional IRA is tax-deferred. So they're taxed differently. It's really up to you to figure out what strategy works best for you. The thing with self-directed IRAs is you're investing in what you know best. There is a tax savings that comes along with it because you want to grow tax-free or tax-deferred, and you're getting that true diversification in your retirement portfolio. So, without further ado, I'm real happy to introduce our guest speaker. His name is John Delia. He's got extensive history working with real estate investors. He is from the good old state of Detroit, Michigan. Hey, John. How are you?
Howdy, Brian. Good day. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for joining us. So I'm gonna go ahead and let you take it over and get started here, and then I will meet you at the end for Q&A.
Awesome. Appreciate you guys hosting, and I will share my screen. So you should be able to see my screen. I'm going to go ahead and go in presentation mode, and I will just get started. If there's any technical difficulties, someone please feel free to let me know. Happy to be here. Once again, thanks for hosting. Today's topic is superior partnerships and superior strategies for real estate investing. So disclaimer, I do have my assistant with me. His name is Baron. He makes a lot of noise, and he will be hanging out with us today. So if you hear him in the background, feel free to ask him questions at the end. This is an educational resource. Most of this webinar was being drafted from my personal experience. It's just a touch on the surface, so I don't expect you guys to learn everything from this, hour-long session, but I'm sure you'll learn a lot. And basically, I'm just sharing ideas of what you should consider. I have been investing with and through self-directed IRAs now for 10 years, so fairly good experience in that realm. What this webinar is not, it's not everything you need to know. It's not financial advice, and it's technically not investment advice. Like I said, this is going to be a lot of my personal experience and just sharing what I've learned over the years. So here we are, 2022, and right now, myself, John Delia, I'm a second-generation real estate developer. I've been hands-on in real estate and construction for the last 12 years. I bought my first property in 2010. Today, my largest building is bigger than a football field in the good old state of Michigan, Detroit specifically, 70,000 square feet, bigger than a football field. Our company invests in about 6 different cities across 3 states, so we've been able to scale our portfolio now. It's taken a decade to do so, but we've implemented a lot of systems, strategies, and processes along the way to provide the structure to scale. I'm building my first 17 home subdivision. So a lot of my work over the last 10 years is focused on construction of existing structures. I like to tell people I love the headache of 100-year-old houses. And now we're maturing into new build ground up construction. So it's very exciting. We own over 53 residential units in most of these markets. So, to me, it seems like a small number, but I guess it is a large number. And as I mentioned, I've completed numerous self-directed IRA deals. I think in real estate investment circles, we like to consider it part of creative financing, but I definitely think it's an excellent vehicle, and I'll share more why. So my traditional company is called Housing Joint Venture. I've taken my experience over this last decade, and we've been building a real estate platform powered by software to help bring more transparency to the private investing market and to the joint venture market. So in this presentation, I'll share more about the business, but Housing Joint Venture is now the software company that's come out of the hands-on construction, the numerous IRA deals, and the cross-state, cross-border transactions. So this is just showing you some of our active and real projects. All of these, except for one, are real buildings. Multiple states, multiple cities. Our asset classes are apartments, warehouses, single-family SFRs, duplexes. I've invested in all types of assets. And like I said, over the last 10 years, I've typically specialized in assets that have been what I call off-grid or vacant for 10 years or more. So when you talk about learning through experience, somehow managed to pick some of the most difficult asset classes to learn from. So grateful for it. So really, how did I get here? What led to this? And obviously I mentioned I'm a second generation developer, but really, how did I get here? And I wanted to bring up this image. The image is from 2017, but this deal I purchased in 2010. This was my first self-directed IRA deal ever. And actually, I'll just share more. I went on the internet and I went to Public Record and I said, man, let me just go and look and see. And back in August 27, 2010, John Delia, personally purchased this property for $9,500. And if you notice, the seller below me was National City Bank. And back in 2010, if you guys remember what was previously deemed the Great Recession, the economy fell out, the financial catastrophe of 2008, and banks had a lot of real estate owned assets that they were selling due to foreclosures, et cetera. I started buying a lot of vacant foreclosed buildings that needed renovation. So I was able to pick up this deal in cash. I transferred it, I think, a year later to JSD Holdings Group, John Sunshine Delia. I felt I needed an LLC at the time. And, in 2012, you'll see that this asset then traded to what's known as Equity Trust Company. And they're another custodial provider of IRAs. They're fairly large. But that was the first time I did a deal where the asset that I had purchased, renovated, and fixed ended up going to somebody's self-directed IRA deal and going through that custodial process. So, I think sitting here now a decade later, 10 years later, to give a talk at a custodian is a privilege because, 10 years ago, I was 20 years old and I did a self-directed IRA deal. And as you see, the values and the pricing of this property has kind of gone up year over year, which is great. So, like I said, my name's John Delia. Most people think of me when I say I own buildings and I do real estate as the guy on the left. Sometimes I get to say I'm a real estate developer, but really I like to tell people I'm a construction cowboy. I think that previously in my career, I might have found some shame to not, always being in a suit or in an office building or behind a computer. But I remember as I got into the business, my father was a developer, and really, I started off in the yard. I started off doing really dirty things, and I started working on buildings and in the field. And I remember him telling me that the work is in the field, it's not in the office. And I remember when I finally earned my right to be in an office, it's after being on construction sites and job sites for a long time, and being at Home and Depot and Lowe's and all those big box retailers for a long time. So I kind of take pride in having my archive of photos now, because I think to myself, man, I really had to learn all the facets and all the aspects of construction. And construction is really what I like to say is the driving force of real estate development, of property ownership, etc. So if you're investing in real estate, you really need to understand construction and what that means because ultimately that's the core of the business. I like to say I've been in a lot of dangerous situations, not quite dangerous, but a lot of fun hands-on learning. And a lot of the work was dirty. These are not the images you always see on social media. These are not the cars. I'm not showing you my Gulf Stream, which I don't really have, but I am showing you kind of what it looks like in the field. So I thought to myself, why is real estate investing necessary? And I know you guys are here and you probably get it. Real estate's important. But from my perspective, I'll share a few points. I think today everyone's well aware of what inflation is. After a decade of, a bull market, essentially, we've now hit this point of inflation where our purchasing power doesn't buy us as much as it used to. So I believe real estate is a great inflation hedge. I tend to tell people real estate is capital preservation, because whether it's a down payment, whether it's cash, whatever equity you're putting in the deal, you're able to preserve that capital with a brick and mortar asset. Next, real estate is great because of the cash flow and the potential appreciation. So typically we like to buy assets that can produce income over a monthly, quarterly, or annual basis. And we also like to believe that those assets will go up in value over a time horizon in the future. As I mentioned, real estate is capital preservation. So the money that I put into buildings, I think of them as planting seeds in which I get the fruits and the benefits of those seeds being planted, nurtured, and taken care of over time. Direct ownership in real estate also has its tax benefits. I tend to tell people that you want to earn as much as you can on paper. Once you have that earning, and there's never an earning problem in my opinion, but once you have that tax obligation in which you're finding ways to minimize or reduce your tax implications, real estate has been a vehicle in which most millionaires have on their balance sheet due to the tax implications and the advantages. So you definitely want to get with your tax professional to discuss those things. And finally, as I mentioned, 90% of millionaires have real estate on their balance sheet and own real estate. And real estate is a great way to truly create wealth because, as I mentioned, the appreciation of the values, because of that equity, it's a great vehicle today to create wealth. And lastly, I tell people, most of the time we're working a job and we're waking up every day, we get in our cars and we go to an office or we go to a building or we go to our employer and we're trading our energy and our time for money. And in an inflationary scenario, although let's say you might have 100,000 in a bank account, what you might not account for is that inflation that says that the purchasing power is less, the dollar is less valuable. And if you saw what's happening with the euro and the pound, it's not doing well right now. So when you're trading your time for money, you want to make sure that you're maintaining that energy and that value. And really, this really didn't hit me until about 2017, when I published my first book. It's called Life, Liberty, and Property, A Guide to Successful Real Estate Investing. And I went to Amazon and I pulled a sample page from the book. And the chapter is called, I Thought My Millionaire Dad Was a Bum. How real estate, it was a personal story, how real estate buys you freedom. And growing up, I grew up in New York on Long Island. And I remember my dad was home. He was on the couch. He was making dinner. We would hang out after school. He would take me places. And, I grew up in a fairly affluent suburb where, although we weren't driving these luxury cars and all that stuff, I remember my dad wasn't like everyone else's parents who were lawyers or engineers or doctors. And he wasn't always getting up and going to that random office building where he had an employer. And I thought he was a bum. I was like, what are you doing? Why are you home? Why aren't you at some job making money? And it turns out my dad was a home builder. My dad was a real estate developer. My dad owned hundreds of apartments in which it gave him the time freedom to be able to spend with his family and spend with his loved ones. And I think that's what people miss about real estate, is that it's not just about the financial ROI. I think it's the leverage of creating an income or creating wealth outside of your traditional employer or your traditional monthly income, and having something that can create, a time replacement, meaning real estate can buy you your freedom and buy you access to, instead of trading your time for money or going into the office and checking in, instead that income can now create the freedom so you can do the things you love most. Because most of the time, when you ask people, why do you want money? Why do you want to be wealthy? Why do you want this money? You know, it's not just because they want to be rich and get a nice car or all the designer stuff. It's because they want to contribute to their community. They want to spend time with their loved ones. They want to do their passion. So never forget that real estate can buy your freedom. So how does real estate fit into a modern portfolio, and especially in a climate like today? And I'm just going to introduce a basic concept called the modern portfolio theory. And traditionally, the old world, we would just invest in stocks and bonds and traditional assets that your financial advisor or your broker would recommend. But I think a lot of intelligent people have woken up, and we recognize that you need to have some diversification to that portfolio. And now the modern portfolio says that I should take a percentage of that portfolio and I should diversify into alternative assets. And technically, real estate investing outside of your primary residence is an alternative asset. And you can bucket it with crypto, you could bucket it with owning franchises, but it's an alternative asset. And in today's environment, we believe, and I truly believe, that real estate should be a part of that modern portfolio. So what are the challenges and hurdles of real estate investing? And I'm going to actually read a short story. I like to call it a poem, but it's really a short story that I was thinking through this week. And as I do that, I'm going to go ahead and put another image on the screen. And I drew this image on my iPad. Excuse the sketch, but hey, I'm not an artist. I'm an investor. But I'm going to go ahead and read the way things are. And remember, the premise is what are some of the challenges and obstacles? The way things are. When you decide to invest in real estate, you do what most people do. You save up money for a down payment, whether it's 3.5 to 30% of the costs. You then apply and get qualified for a loan. For many people, a fixer-upper is an opportunity to create value and more equity. Rather than being satisfied with a traditional loan, you might opt for a renovation loan or a 203K loan. To be able to use this product, the bank typically requires that you have a construction scope of work, you have a budget, and you have a selected licensed contractor who can do the work. When approved for this loan product, the bank will typically reimburse you for the payments and improvements made to the property as per your construction scope and your draw schedule. Each time a necessary item is repaired and the project is moved forward, the bank will send a representative to inspect the work, or you will submit photography of the work being satisfied. At that point, you will be reimbursed for the cost to complete the work as per budget. So, just because you're qualified for the loan and you were able to purchase the property doesn't mean the bank is giving you a lump sum of money up front to complete the property or the project. Your role as owner, or I'll label you developer, is giving you the power to direct the bank loan funds to the stakeholders who are there to complete the work. This process of a draw schedule for reimbursement and inspection allows for checks and balances of all parties, and it ensures that the bank's financial investment is safe and that the contractors and you as a project manager are ensuring that the work is going to standard, it's completed on time and on schedule. Now, things operate differently in the investment real estate market when you're using private funds, and especially when you're using self-directed IRAs. Private mortgage lenders or hard money lenders might operate similar to banks when it comes to withdrawals and reimbursements and inspections. However, private real estate investors and self-directed IRA investors don't always have the same protections and structures in place for their investment. If investor Jack decides he wants to invest in John's real estate development project, all Jack has to do is simply submit proper forms to his self-directed IRA custodian. Once the paperwork is processed, the investment amount is funded and sent to John. Now it's John's responsibility to complete the work as per the scope of work and the budget. However, there is no checks and balances to ensure funds are used as agreed upon. When investor Jack invests in a real estate development project, After Jack's investment documents are processed and the project is funded, those funds should actually flow to a property-specific escrow account. This account should allow for transparency of accounting and auditing at any time and in real time. Each time John, the developer, needs funds for the project, he must submit proof that the work is being done and receipts and necessary inspections and photography. After which things are verified, the money is then released from escrow and paid out to John, the developer. This now makes it so construction is no longer a black hole when it comes to private debt and private investment. In the case that the developer does not have the necessary funds to begin the project, a small percentage can be allocated up front and earmarked for the initial start of the project to get the ball rolling. As the project moves forward towards completion, each milestone has submission of receipts, or what we like to call proof of work, and can be audited by a third-party inspector or via photography. Each financial transaction can be tied to each milestone and clearly audited and determine the use. This serves as better governance and better procedures for transparency. It sets a proper control so that funds are not misappropriated and so that all parties involved have more trust in the inherent system. Thanks for listening to my story. Now let's hop back in. So I think you guys might have heard some of the challenges and hurdles I've alluded to, especially when using a self-directed in IRAs. And now I want to talk about some of the ways we've structured deals in the past. So this brings us to what I like to call an ugly house, but I think this house is actually a gem. And this house was a property we purchased in cash in Dayton, Ohio, that's been vacant or had been vacant for over a decade, almost 10 years. This is currently what the project looks like. I'll share my screen one more time and bring up kind of another collateral item. And this is just a basic case study. So this house was bought in Dayton, Ohio. It was a single family. It was built in 1914, so nearly 100 years old. It was a 3-bed, 1-bath, 1,300 square feet. And believe it or not, we purchased this house for $4,000 in cash. Like, whoa, that's unbelievable. Is that real? Yeah, it's real. And those properties exist. However, those properties come with a lot of technical difficulties, meaning they've been vacant and off the grid for decades, and they need extensive renovation. Now, one might think we were crazy to tell you that we fully renovated this house for $35,000 with a joint venture partner, and all in, we put about $40,000 into this property. This property has now been rented for 2 years. This is the second year, but we were also able to refinance out in September of 21, excuse me, dates off, for $58,000. So we were able to get all of our money out of the deal plus some. And the house was rented for $800 a month. The tenants are actually moving out this month, which is a little disappointing. But after 10 years of vacancy, this property was brought back on the grid. Now, our company bought the house with cash, and our investor partner trusted us to invest their funds on our behalf into this deal. Now, once again, as I talked about with Jack, with deals like these in terms of joint ventures, there's a lot that goes on, and ultimately you need to trust the partner and the operator you're working with. So let me slow down and let's talk about what is a joint venture. So a joint venture, whether it's in real estate or not, is simply a business agreement where multiple parties agree to pool resources to accomplish a specific task. This task could be opening up a business, it could be buying an item, or it could be purchasing a house such as the one I just showed you. Each one of those parties are going to be responsible for the profits, the loss, and the costs associated with the project. So in a joint venture, you're a direct owner of the asset, and there's what we like to call upside and downside. And, you know, typically that upside is what you would gain in equity, but if things go wrong, that downside can come with financial burdens and mistakes. But you can join two separate entities together in order to complete this specific task. So how is a joint venture structured? So what this image is showing you is that particularly what a real estate joint venture could look like. You have a sponsor, we'll call the sponsor John the developer, whose job it is to implement the business plan. John says that we're going to invest in this property in Dayton, Ohio. John's going to make the scope of work, the construction budget, and he's going to oversee the day-to-day operations. And the investor, Jack, is going to provide capital from his self-directed IRA. Now, Jack is going to have limited day-to-day involvement of this property. He's going to be an executive. He's going to be managing a franchise, but he's not going to be taking contractor calls. He's not going to hear about all the day-to-day headaches, but he is going to have the rights to certain executive level decision-making. These partners create a new entity. That entity then owns a site-specific LLC, which is that property. And when you think about this, how do you structure it and how do you know what the necessary documentation is? And once again, in the private debt markets, in the self-directed IRA markets, you're absolutely relying on your developer or your operator to understand the structure. So typically, we like to talk about standard documentation. And now I'll just show you another set of resources. It should be here. Nope, not that one. It is this one. So we're calling this kind of joint venture business the breezy way for real estate investing. And as I mentioned, this diagram on the right is kind of illustrating that joint venture structure. So us would be John, the developer. You would be Jack with your IRA and the real estate asset. And we would be co-ownership of the entity that owns the property. And what we've done through our track record is standardize this process to bring more clarity, to bring more transparency to the system. And basically, we like to say that when you're doing a joint venture, here's the standard sets of documentation, whether you're doing one with us or you're partnering with other operators, that you should probably ask for or be made aware about. And the thing about private sector debt and real estate investing is that sometimes I'll give you the analogy of when I was a kid playing at my grandmother's house, and I would be outside playing in an ant mound. And here I am, this giant kid with big hands, and I would crush the ants, and I felt so powerful. And I realized, oh my God, that's similar to experienced and inexperienced people. What's different with real estate, and especially direct ownership, is that when you directly own the real estate, there is limited SEC, Security and Exchange protections, or rules that require you be an accredited investor or you have a certain net worth. So the investor protections are on the credibility of the company, the operator, and that track record. So you have to understand that there's a lot of systems that should be in place. And like those ants, if you're an ant with giants, or as my former attorney used to tell me, John, if you get in the ocean with sharks, they eat. And you hear a lot about, bad relationships with contractors or people misappropriating funds, etc. And it's our goal to help to reduce those occurrences and instances and to better educate investors, because ultimately we believe with better education and with better transparency, hopefully people want to allocate their capital into more deals. So once again, on the left are the standard documents that we've said are critical to doing deals. And I'll just take you through some of those document sets. And a lot of these are real documents. They're not just made up. And the first set is that new entity that's going to own that asset-specific property. And, that's filed with your state. A lot of times you're going to work with an attorney. We have one in-house that we work with. But these documents need to be created to also, in an instance, protect you, whether you need to go to court, whether you need to litigate, etc. So, the articles of incorporation would file that new company. Then after that company is filed, you would have what's known as an operating agreement. And this agreement simply tells you how the company operates, what are the functions, and what are the roles and responsibilities of all members. And then there's some standard sections of that agreement that have the definitions. Once again, you might not be aware of some of those definitions, how the organization, admission to new members, what's the management, how do you terminate a member or transfer, what capital is required, how do you dissolve or liquidate the company, what are the accounting and reporting procedures, etc. Next, you would file with the IRS, just like we have social security numbers, you would get a business social security number, which is known as an EIN number. When you're purchasing a property, whether it's already owned by the developer or you're purchasing it, you would then execute a purchase contract to document that this new entity is purchasing this specific property. Then, with most real estate closings, you're going to go to a title company, and during the title closing process, you're going to be issued what's known as a HUD-1 settle statement. Now, this settle statement acts as an itemized list of expenses and fees that need to be paid in terms of the transfer, the ownership, the taxes, etc. But it's also used when it comes down to reporting and bookkeeping. A lot of times your tax professional is going to request copies of your HUD-1 statements as they're doing your tax filings. In addition, you're going to want, in most cases, and especially in the case of renovating older properties, we typically like to provide not just the reassurance that John's a construction cowboy, but a home inspection report that's going to allow a third-party licensed professional to come in and inspect the property and basically give you an itemized list of issues, potential issues, and things that should be remedied with this property. But I will state this, that just like we all are human, sometimes the inspector is human and they make mistakes or they miss certain things. So although this isn't a catch-all, it's a good diligence protection method to at least have extra sets of eyes to bring some more clarity to the process. Next, you're going to want a resolution, which is a written statement saying that the members of this entity agree to specific actions being taken by this entity. And in LLCs, it's all about not piercing the corporate veil. Why do people get a specific entity? Because they want to, what you say is separate church and state or protect your personal assets. So the LLC needs to be documenting what it's doing, how it's doing it, and who approved that being done. Next, I like to talk about the communication plan, because although certain parties might not have day-to-day responsibilities, there's still a lot of moving parts going on in a deal. And up front, you should understand what are the roles and responsibilities of all the stakeholders, and what are the means for when and if communication needs to happen and how. And in this communication plan, it kind of goes through the step-by-step items of everything that's going to go on between selecting an attorney or an architect or selecting an appraiser, negotiating contracts, determining if any zoning relief, obtaining pre-development funding, performing a market analysis. All of these things are going to take on whose responsibility for all of these specific milestones that are necessary. Next, you're going to want a bill of sale. So a bill of sale is just another document showing that, hey, John has transferred the ownership of this property that he's owned himself to now this new entity. And it's no different than a receipt. It's providing an additional receipt outside of the purchase contract showing that this bill of sale was executed. And in addition, we also execute an additional document we like to call the general assignment agreement. Now, when you're doing a deal, there are multiple forms of what I like to call IP, intellectual property, that comes with that asset. We may have architectural renderings or specific, mechanical drawings or warranties, etc. And what this assignment is doing is this assignment is assigning my rights as a developer of all of these IP collateral items to this new entity, saying that this new entity is now the owner, no longer John the developer. Next, you're going to see the deed and the deed transfer from that previous owner, John the developer, to now this new entity that's executed this transaction. And then you're going to want to see, hey, does this new entity have protection and coverage in the case of a catastrophe, and you want insurance? So then the entity would take out insurance on the property, and that would be designated the beneficiary. Finally, or not finally, in addition, you're going to need a financial model. A pro forma is just a fancy way we say an Excel financial model. And up front in the pre-development and the planning stage, as part of that executive level decision making, you're going to want to work with your developer to evaluate the financial model, to review it, to understand the dynamics, because your financial model is the forecast and the projections of ultimately where you're steering this ship to be successful. And then finally, not finally, but once again, in addition to, you're going to want a scope of work, an itemized scope of work. This scope of work can be provided by your contractor. As I alluded to earlier, your home inspector can potentially call out a lot of this work because that home inspection report is going to be there for you. But ultimately, you need to understand what are all the steps that we're going to take when we're improving and adding value to this property. And that scope of work is going to then be tied to your itemized budget. Next, up front, you're going to want comparable market analysis, meaning what are other properties in this neighborhood trading for, renting for, and how do we begin to anchor our own financial data? And these comparables will help feed into your financial model. These comparables will help determine the level of finishes you do in that scope of work and the rents that you'll potentially be able to charge. But you'll want that information up front because what we also do is we galvanize some of this data in the joint venture agreement and in the operating agreement. Because we like to agree up front as much as we can. That way, when there's uncertainty during the project or issues were to occur, we're not flying at the seat of our pants. We've kind of thought through a lot of what can and might happen. Next, whether it's an existing home or a new building, you're going to want to get floor plans of the building. And this just helps with measurements. It helps with not being on the job site. It helps with ordering. And there's plenty of technology and applications that you can use today to get those floor plans. So that was the concluding section of just what are some of the documents necessary. And now we'll jump back in. So as I mentioned, some of the documentation, joint venture agreement, operating agreement, scope of work, management agreement, general assignment agreement, bill of sale, resolutions, your communication plan, your voting log. These are all of the necessary documents, and I say they're necessary. I think inexperienced operators might not be aware, but with better education and better awareness comes better deals, better success, and better outcomes. And next, we might talk about what are the fees? Because typically your pro forma is going to estimate, the financial returns, et cetera. But some of the inputs in the deal that we might not think about are government recording and transfer fees. So when we talked about that HUD-1 for the closing statement, when you record the new deed, when you file things with your county, those are all being charged and they're being paid for. Some of these numbers I got from the specific deal that I put here. I just pulled them for the HUD-1. These fees are going to vary in your jurisdiction and your municipality. Then you think about prepping for construction. A lot of the soft cost work needs to be discussed on who gets paid to do that work and how much does it cost. So as I mentioned with a home inspector, you'll pay a home inspection fee. You might be able to get a roof inspection. You might pay for architectural plans or property photography. And there might be a construction management fee to actually operate and see through that day-to-day action gets done. But all of those are going to be charges that affect not only your return, but your return. So, and your budget. So you need to be aware. And finally, never forget that there's additional transaction fees. If you get a paper check in the mail, someone's going to pay for that overnight postage. If you send a wire, your bank might charge an incoming wire or an outgoing wire. There's going to be annual accounting that needs to be paid for. And if you're using an electronic signature platform, you're going to pay fees there too. So you have to go into this with really some diligence and care on trying to understand the things you might not be aware of or the different financial and business implications of the transaction. So let's just dive a little deeper into what we talked about in terms of the roles of the stakeholders and then their responsibilities. And what we like to do, as I mentioned, is have this communication plan. And here's just a sample of it, which really just defines the partner's roles and responsibilities. And when you think about the owner, the developer, the property manager, different service providers, whether it's the resident, each one of these milestones and development tasks should have an accountability person. And in a plan like this, you're going to want to upfront be aware of who is to be accountable when it's time to be accountable. So now I'll slow down and just give you a few key takeaways, and then I'd love to hop into some questions and answers. So time, energy, and money is what I like to tell people is all about real estate. It takes time, energy, and money. Your focus, your attention. So managing real estate is tough, but you want to partner with experts. Those experts should not only have a track record, but should open up that track record and be able to show you case studies, be able to show you milestones, be able to show you that they have that level of experience necessary to help you succeed. Next, you want to really understand your real numbers for true ROI. A lot of people only model for the return on investment or for their IRR or whatever financial jargon they're using. But if you're not considering some of the soft costs to development, some of the management fees, the transaction fees, you might not actually see that true ROI. So what I like to tell people is when you're calculating your return on investment, don't just be impressed by a percentage that someone tells you they made, because you don't have enough data, meaning you need all the inputs to how they're calculating the return on investment. So when someone says, I got a 27% return versus a 16%, you really need to unfold the data that they're using to get that return. Next, you want to create realistic expectations of time commitments. How much time are you willing to put into a project? How much time do you want to dedicate to your investments as a business? Those time commitments should match your life goals, your personal goals, and your availability. And those time commitments are going to help guide you on what type of deals might be fitting for your situation and your scenario. As we mentioned, you want to clearly define the roles and responsibilities of all parties. You want to also create your own investment thesis prior to investing. A lot of times people with money get shiny object syndrome, and we like to say that if money's just sitting in the bank, 9 times out of 10 it's going to get spent. So if you, prior to allocating resources, prior to using your self-directed IRA to invest in a deal, you should say that, hey, I'm Jack and I like new build construction, or I'm Jack and I like single family units, or I'm Jack and I like to invest in warehouses. Here's my why, here's my thesis, here's where I think the opportunity is, even prior to investing in that market or partnering or working with an operator. You need to set your North Star and anchor yourself. And that's going to take some time, some diligence, and some commitment, but ultimately it's also going to help you be successful. The best JVs or joint ventures are well-defined and not ambiguous. So some of those documents we showed in terms of standards, a lot of this is vetting a new partner, similar to a marriage or a significant relationship. You're going to be transactionally and financially, in bed with someone. So the more specifics we can have on paper, the more difficult conversations we can have up front, the more successful you could potentially set yourself up for. You want to discuss financing, funding, credit, tax matters very early on, even before you get into the deal. You want to understand all of those implications to your transaction and to the investment that you're evaluating. And you also want to create a framework for evaluating and hiring your professional team. You're going to be bringing in a lot of stakeholders to work on your behalf, as we mentioned, whether it's a home inspector, an architect, an attorney, a tax professional, a contractor. But how do you evaluate that professional? What questions do you ask that professional? What should be the expectations of that professional? A lot of this should be done up front in the planning and in your thesis and in your business plan. You want to ensure that all your legal docs are in order. Once again, you don't want to find this out at the litigation table or in court that, hey, we didn't have the proper structure, the proper documentation, or the proper documents. So, sometimes I think the best attorney is not just a transactional attorney. They're a counselor who's helping make you aware of what's to come or what could happen. And I also like to say that the best professionals they've been to war multiple times, so they serve as a general. Meaning, if I'm new to an investment business or an investment market, I'm actually expecting that the leader that I work with or the professional that I hire can make me aware of the potholes in the road because they've driven down this road 20 times and this is my first time. But if they say, hey, John, those Michigan roads, you might want to get some solid tires because, a pothole could really disrupt your car. I'd like to be made aware of that before I drive my sports car down a pothole, and ruin things. And finally, you really need to be systems oriented. As I mentioned earlier, every day we wake up because, we have to provide for our families and for ourselves, and we trade our time and our energy for money, for these resources. And you cannot take lightly, what it took for you to earn, save, gain your credit, gain your experience, etc. So as you're allocating, and if it's especially with your retirement funds, you want to ensure that you're systems oriented and there's proper structure in place to protect your financial investment. Because ultimately, rule number one in investing is don't lose money. And rule number two is don't forget rule number one. So, with proper diligence, with proper care, and with proper structure, you can thrive too in the private real estate investing market. And I'd like to say thank you for listening. I'll end with just an anecdote that says the point of this presentation is to also help you understand not just what it's going to take to be successful, but what it's going to take to thrive and scale. As I mentioned, over the last decade, I was able to scale from 0 units to over 53 in multiple cities. And I say to myself, there's a lot of learning along the way. So definitely be open to that journey. But, you can thrive. This isn't to scare you, but it's to help you be professional. I view myself as a professional investor, and you never want to be one of those people who say, I used to invest in real estate and then the market changed. Oh yeah, I got burned in real estate because my contractor, or oh, I got burned in real estate because of my tenants. When really, you have the financial obligation and responsibility to create that success. So I'll stop here, and yeah, I'd love to take some questions and answers, etc. I can't hear you. Brian, are you talking? Minor technical difficulties, but if you do have questions, feel free to hop in the chat. So once again, thank you guys for all participating in this webinar today. My name is John Delia with Housing Joint Venture. The flyer says Belmont Preserve. I should share what Belmont Preserve is. Belmont Preserve is a new home subdivision being built in Springfield, Ohio. As I mentioned, each deal technically becomes a separate entity and a separate LLC. So, Belmont Preserve is going to be a new build 17 home subdivision built in Springfield, Ohio. We're very excited for it. It's our first ground up subdivision. We filed an exemption with the IRS to be able to raise money from private investors using the rule general solicitation. Those investors must be accredited, so it's a little different than a traditional joint venture, but that's the company that I'm representing also today. Is this new entity to build this subdivision? Most of those deals can be seen on our platform, housingjointventure.com. Simply create a free account. And once again, thank you for participating. We're really happy for the host here today. That's very helpful. And we're hoping you found a lot of value in this webinar.